You've spent years doing what was expected of you, showing up, working hard, solving problems, and carrying responsibilities without complaint. Somewhere along the way, that became your identity, the one who gets things done. But beneath it all, there's a quiet question. Has it actually given you control? Because if you're over 40, you've likely started to notice something that doesn't quite sit right. No matter how consistent you are, no matter how much effort you invest, your progress feels limited. Not stuck, but capped, as if there's an invisible line just out of reach. At first, it's easy to dismiss. You tell yourself it's normal, that stability is enough, that this is simply how life works. But the feeling doesn't disappear. It grows slowly, quietly, until you can no longer. But the feeling doesn't disappear. It grows slowly, quietly, until you can no longer ignore it. And that feeling isn't random. It's the result of how you've been conditioned to think about work, money, progress from the very beginning. A mindset designed for reliability, but not for control. You were taught to complete tasks, meet expectations, and operate within systems built by others. While that builds discipline, it also shapes how you perceive opportunity. You focus on execution instead of direction, effort instead of leverage. There's nothing wrong with working hard, but if all your progress depends on how much time you give, then your growth will always be limited, because time is finite. And once it's gone, so is your ability to produce more. That's where the shift begins, not in what you do, but in how you think. Because a worker asks, what needs to be done today? An owner asks, what can I build that continues without me? And those two questions lead to entirely different lives. Most people never make that shift, not because they lack ability, but because they've spent decades reinforcing one way of thinking. They've become efficient, reliable, consistent, but always within someone else's structure. And eventually, you begin to feel it. That quiet realization that no matter how well you perform, you're still operating within limits you didn't create. Still trading time for progress, still depending on create. Still trading time for progress, still depending on something outside your control. That's the moment that matters, because you can either ignore it and continue the same pattern, or begin questioning everything you've been taught about how progress really works. Because thinking like an owner doesn't start with a business, it starts with awareness, a new way of seeing time, value, and effort. Value and effort. A way of thinking that goes beyond completing tasks and moves into creating outcomes. An owner doesn't just work harder, they think differently. They look for leverage, systems, and ways to multiply effort instead of repeating it. They stop asking how to do more and start asking how to make what they do count more. And once that shift begins, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often your time is exchanged directly for results, how your progress stops the moment you stop, and how that model, no matter how stable, cannot scale. But here's what changes everything. You don't have to start over. You don't have to abandon what you've built. You only need to start thinking differently within it to see opportunities where you once saw routine. Because ownership isn't just about what you have, it's about how you approach everything. It's a mindset that reshapes how you make decisions, how you invest your time, and how you define progress itself. Shapes how you make decisions, how you invest your time, and how you define progress itself. And as that mindset grows, your behavior follows. You move with intention. You seek long-term value instead of short-term completion. You begin building instead of just finishing. That's when things start to shift. Slowly at first, then more clearly, you begin to feel a different kind of control. Not over everything, but over your direction. And that alone changes how you show up each day. So the real question isn't whether you've worked hard enough, it's whether you've been thinking in a way that allows your effort to grow beyond your time. Because effort without leverage will always hit a ceiling. What you're about to hear may challenge how you've approached work for years. It will ask you to step beyond the mindset that kept you stable and into one that gives you something far more powerful. And if you stay with it, you may realize it's not too late to shift, not too late to think differently, not too late to move from simply working to building something that finally works for you. There is a form of identity that develops slowly, quietly, and without deliberate intention. It isn't chosen in a single moment. It is shaped through repetition, expectation, and the consistent fulfillment of responsibility. A man becomes known as reliable, capable, dependable, and over time, that recognition becomes the foundation of how he sees himself. If I were to begin again, I would examine this identity carefully. Because while it appears strong, it may also contain a limitation that isn't immediately visible. There is a pattern that begins early. A man is taught to complete what is given to him, to perform well, to meet expectations. He learns that effort produces reward, consistency produces stability, and reliability produces trust. These lessons are reinforced over years of repetition, and because they are reinforced, they are accepted. If I were beginning again, I would not reject these teachings. I would expand beyond them. Because they build strength, but they do these teachings. I would expand beyond them. Because they build strength, but they do not necessarily create control. There is also the gradual shift from behavior to identity. A man does not simply perform tasks. He becomes someone who performs them. He does not merely solve problems. He becomes someone who solves them. And in that transformation, he begins to define himself by what he does, rather than what he directs. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this distinction early, because what a man does repeatedly becomes what he believes himself to be. There is also the reward that reinforces this identity. A man who performs well is recognized. He is trusted. He is relied upon. Others bring him responsibility. They depend on his ability to execute. And through this, he gains position, not through ownership, but through usefulness. This may appear to be progress, but it carries a quiet limitation. If I were beginning again, I would not confuse usefulness with control. There is also the invisible ceiling that forms as this identity strengthens. A man's progress becomes tied to his ability to perform. The more he does, the more he is given. The more he is given, the more he must do. And within this cycle, growth becomes directly linked to effort. The more he is given, the more he must do. And within this cycle, growth becomes directly linked to effort. This is the structure of the worker. And within that structure, there is a limit. If I were beginning again, I would recognize that this limit is not imposed by ability, but by design. There are many who reach a point in life and begin to feel this ceiling. They are not failing. They are not stagnant. They are progressing, but within a confined range. Their effort increases, yet their advancement does not rise proportionally. And this creates a quiet question, one that may not always be spoken, but is always felt. If I were beginning again, I would not ignore this question, because it marks the beginning of awareness. There is also the realization that this ceiling is not visible at first. It only appears after years of repetition. A man believes that if he continues, something greater will come. Yet, over time, he begins to see that his progress follows a pattern. He begins to see that his progress follows a pattern that does not expand beyond his effort. If I were beginning again, I would study this pattern closely. There is also the example of men who remained within this identity for many years. They became skilled, experienced, trusted, yet their position remained dependent on their continued presence. Their progress stopped when they stopped. This is not failure, it is limitation. If I were beginning again, I would not accept this limitation as permanent. There is also the contrast of men who moved beyond this identity. A man such as Henry Ford did not remain defined by what he could personally produce. He shifted from doing to directing, from effort to structure, from repetition to multiplication, and in doing so, he removed the ceiling. If I were beginning again, I would understand this shift deeply. There is also how others perceive this identity. A man operating within the worker mindset There is also how others perceive this identity. A man operating within the worker mindset is respected, valued, even essential, but he is rarely seen as someone who controls the system itself. He is important, but not independent. If I were beginning again, I would not seek importance alone, I would seek control. There is also the emotional attachment to this identity. A man takes pride in his ability to perform. He values his reliability. He sees his consistency as strength, and in many ways, it is. But this attachment can prevent him from seeing beyond it. If I were beginning again, I would not lose this strength, but I would not let it define my limits. There is also the repetition that reinforces the ceiling. Each day the man performs. Each day he completes. Each day he fulfills. Each day the man performs. Each day he completes. Each day he fulfills expectations. And each day the pattern continues until it becomes unquestioned. This is conditioning. If I were beginning again, I would interrupt this conditioning through awareness. There is also the moment when clarity begins to form. A man sees that his effort is not the problem, his discipline is not the problem, his consistency is not the problem. The limitation lies in how his effort is structured. If I were beginning again, I would focus on structure, not effort alone. There is also the beginning of separation. A man starts asking different questions, not what must I do, but what produces beyond what I do. Not how can I perform better, but how can this perform without me? These questions mark the shift. If I were beginning again, I would ask them often. There is also the transformation that follows. A man begins to see himself differently, not only as someone who executes, but as someone who directs, organizes, and builds. This change is gradual, but powerful. If I were beginning again, I would allow it to unfold. There is also the removal of the invisible ceiling, not by working harder, but by thinking differently. A man who shifts his identity begins to act differently, and by acting differently, he produces. A man who shifts his identity begins to act differently, and by acting differently, he produces different results. The ceiling was never fixed. It was accepted. If I were beginning again, I would no longer accept it. There is also a final realization. A man who defines himself by what he does will always be limited by what he can do. But a man who defines himself by what he builds is no longer confined to his own effort, because what he builds can continue. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, do not let your identity be confined to execution. Expand it to creation. Let this be fixed firmly within. I am not only one who works. I am one who builds. I am one who directs. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as awakening. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, I would begin here. I would examine the identity I have accepted. I would recognize the ceiling it creates, and I would expand beyond it, not by abandoning what I have built, but by redefining it, until I am no longer limited by what I can personally produce, but guided by what I can create, direct, and allow to grow beyond me each day, without returning to the pattern that once confined me within the invisible boundaries of effort alone.